Are you afraid of dying? Of course you are. We all are. But what if I told you that this fear is an illusion, that you're being tortured by something that, philosophically, will never happen to you? In the 4th century BC, a man discovered this, and what he did with this discovery was so dangerous they had to silence him. His texts. Only 3 letters survived intact, out of hundreds of works he wrote. His ideas, distorted for centuries. The word Epicurean became synonymous with libertine, glutton, hedonist without control. But that's a lie. Epicurus didn't teach excess. He taught liberation, and the greatest of all liberations was this: death cannot hurt you. Not because there's eternal life. Not because the gods will save you, but because when you truly understand what death is, the fear simply disappears. He called this ataraxia, the absolute tranquility of the soul. And thousands of people for centuries lived without fear because of him. How? His name was Epicurus. And this is the story of how he killed the fear of death. Athens, 341 BC. The city that gave the world Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is in decline. Alexander the Great died recently. His empire fragmented. The Greek world is in political chaos. Constant wars, absolute uncertainty. No one knows if they'll wake up tomorrow under a new tyrant or in the middle of an invasion. And in this scenario of collective terror, people seek answers. Not political answers, existential answers. How do you live in an age when everything can collapse at any moment? How do you find peace when the world around you is pure chaos? How do you stop being afraid of everything? This is where Hellenistic philosophy is born, a totally new type of thought. It's no longer about the ideal city, as Plato wanted. It's no longer about the nature of being, as Aristotle investigated. It's about you, your mind, your suffering, your happiness. 3 schools dominate this period: the Stoics, the Skeptics, and the Epicureans. All promise the same thing: ataraxia, tranquility of the soul, the end of psychological suffering. But each follows a radically different path. The Stoics say, accept fate. Everything is already determined. Your only freedom is how you react. The Skeptics say, suspend judgment. Don't affirm anything with certainty. Doubt is peace. But Epicurus? Epicurus says something far more radical. He says, the fear that paralyzes you has no real basis. You're suffering over fictions, and I can prove it. And that's exactly what he did. But to understand how, we need to go back to the beginning, to the island of Samos, to the birth of a boy who, at 14, would ask a question that would change his life forever. Samos, 341 BC. Epicurus is born in an Athenian colony, son of Neocles, a poor teacher, and Cherastrate, a woman who practiced religious purification rituals. The family isn't wealthy, isn't influential. Epicurus grows up watching his mother recite prayers, make offerings to the gods, trying to calm invisible forces with fear and reverence. And he observes how people live terrified of the gods, of death, of eternal punishment, of forces they don't understand. At 14, he's studying with a teacher named Pamphilus, and Pamphilus begins talking about Hesiod, the poet who wrote the Theogony, the origin of the universe according to Greek mythology. Hesiod says, in the beginning was chaos, and young Epicurus raises his hand. Where did chaos come from? Pamphilus hesitates. Well, chaos simply always existed. But if chaos always existed, Epicurus insists, then there was no beginning. And if there was no beginning, why do we need the gods to explain the origin of things? Silence. This moment changes everything. Epicurus realizes something fundamental. Mythological explanations don't explain anything. They just postpone the question. They transfer the mystery to another entity, the gods. But don't solve the problem, and if the gods don't explain the origin of the universe, why would we have to fear them? This is where his journey begins. At 18, he goes to Athens to fulfill his mandatory military service, and it's there that he encounters the texts of Democritus, the atomist philosopher who lived a century earlier. Democritus said something impossible for the time. The universe isn't governed by gods. The universe is made of atoms, indivisible, eternal particles that move in the void and, when combined, form everything that exists. There's no divine purpose, no destiny, no cosmic plan, just atoms and void. For most people, this is terrifying, but for Epicurus, it's liberating. Because if the universe is made of atoms, then death isn't the end of you. It's just the dissolution of the atoms that compose you. And if there's no immortal soul, there's no eternal punishment, no divine judgment, no hell. The fear of death, based on an illusion. But Epicurus doesn't stop there. He spends the next years studying, traveling, absorbing everything. Democritus, Aristotle, the Cynics, the Cyrenaics. He studies Aristippus of Cyrene, the philosopher who said that pleasure is the supreme good. But Aristippus was hedonistic in the crude sense. Seek immediate pleasure, the maximum sensation possible. Epicurus disagrees. Because he sees the problem, immediate pleasure often brings subsequent pain. Eating too much, drinking too much, uncontrolled sex. All of this generates suffering. So Epicurus begins to make a radical distinction. Pleasure isn't intense sensation. Pleasure is the absence of pain. And with this idea, he's about to turn the world upside down. But before that, he needs a place, a space where he can teach without being persecuted. Because what he's about to say will enrage many people. Athens, 306 BC. Epicurus is 35 years old. He returns to the city with a clear mission, to found his own philosophical school, but he doesn't do it like the others. Plato had the academy, a formal, elitist institution reserved for aristocrats. Aristotle had the Lyceum, a space for walking and debate, still academic, still distant. Epicurus? Epicurus buys a simple house on the outskirts of Athens, and behind it there's a garden. He hung a sign at the entrance. "Stranger, here you will be welcome. Here the supreme good is pleasure." And something extraordinary happens. People begin to arrive. Not just men, women too. Slaves, prostitutes, poor people, people without social status. This is scandalous for the time. No philosophical school accepted women. No school mixed social classes like this. But Epicurus doesn't care. Because for him, philosophy isn't an abstract intellectual exercise. It's a medicine. And medicine doesn't choose who suffers. They call the place the Garden of Epicurus. And inside there, something revolutionary is happening. Epicurus isn't giving lectures on metaphysics. He's not debating the nature of being or the structure of the ideal city. He's teaching people to stop suffering. And he does this systematically, almost scientifically. He identifies the four greatest fears that paralyze humanity. Fear of the gods, fear of death, fear of pain, fear of not achieving happiness. And then he creates the tetrapharmakos, the fourfold remedy. 4 truths that destroy these fears at the root. First truth, the gods don't care about you. Epicurus doesn't deny the existence of the gods, but he says something even more radical. The gods exist, yes, but they live in perfect ataraxia, absolute tranquility. They don't intervene in the human world. They don't punish. They don't reward. They don't get involved. Why? Because if the gods were perfect and happy, why would they worry about human problems? Worry is suffering, and the gods, by definition, don't suffer. Therefore, you don't need to fear them. You don't need to make sacrifices. You don't need to live under the terror of divine punishment. This frees millions of people from a lifetime of religious fear. Second truth, death cannot hurt you. Here's the masterstroke. Epicurus writes in the letter to Menoetius, one of the few texts that survived intact, "Death is nothing to us, because while we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist." Read that again. When you're alive, death doesn't exist for you. And when death exists, you're no longer there to experience it. Therefore, death never happens to you. You'll never live your own death. You'll never feel the emptiness or the nothingness. Because to feel something, you need to exist. And if you no longer exist, there's no you to suffer. It's logically irrefutable. And this destroys the fear of death at the root. Third truth, pain is bearable. Epicurus observes that pain has two forms. Intense pain, but it doesn't last long. No one can sustain extreme pain for very long. Either you pass out or it passes, or you die. Chronic pain, but it's mild, and if it's mild, it's bearable. He reaches this conclusion from his own experience. Epicurus suffered from kidney stones for years, a pain considered one of the worst a human being can feel. And even so, he wrote letters to friends saying that, despite the physical pain, his mind remained in ataraxia, because he could separate the physical sensation from psychological suffering. Bodily pain is inevitable, but the fear of pain, that can be eliminated. Fourth truth, happiness is easy to achieve. Here, Epicurus makes a brilliant distinction. He divides desires into three categories: natural and necessary desires, simple food, water, shelter, friendship. These are easy to satisfy and bring genuine happiness. Natural but not necessary desires, sophisticated food, sex, luxury. These can be pleasurable, but aren't essential. Vain desires, fame, power, infinite wealth. These can never be satisfied. You'll always want more. Most people live chasing the third category, and that's why they suffer. Epicurus proposes the opposite: self-sufficiency. Live simply. Eat bread and water. Have good friends. Cultivate prudence. Avoid politics. Avoid fame, and you'll be happier than any king. Does it seem radical? It is, but it works. Inside the garden, people are living exactly like this, and they report something extraordinary. They've stopped being afraid. Anxiety about the future disappeared. Terror of death evaporated. The need for status, recognition, external validation, dead. They've found something Greek philosophy had been seeking for centuries: eudaimonia, the good life, genuine happiness. But this didn't go unnoticed, and people in power didn't like it. The garden is growing too fast, and this is creating problems, because Epicurus isn't just teaching philosophy. He's emptying temples. If the gods don't care, why make offerings? If death is nothing, why fear the underworld and pay priests for protection rituals? If happiness lies in self-sufficiency, why seek political power or accumulate wealth? Epicurus is, unwittingly, or perhaps purposefully, dismantling the structures of social control. And this enrages three groups. The priests' Greek religion wasn't just faith, it was economics. Temples were centers of power. Sacrifices moved money. Religious festivals sustained entire cities. And now comes this man saying, the gods don't care about you. Stop wasting resources on them. This is heresy. But it's not just that. It's also a direct financial blow to religious institutions. Rival philosophers, Platonists, and Aristotelians despise Epicurus. Why? Because he's making philosophy too accessible. Plato said that philosophy was for the few enlightened ones, those capable of contemplating the eternal forms, the idea of the good. Aristotle said that excellence, arete, required education, resources, leisure time, things only aristocrats had. Epicurus. Epicurus is saying that anyone can be happy. A slave, a prostitute, a poor man who eats bread and water. You don't need sophisticated education. You don't need status. You don't need wealth. You just need to understand four truths. This is unacceptable to the philosophical elite. They begin spreading rumors. Epicurus is an uncontrolled hedonist. He promotes orgies in the garden. He teaches that there are no moral consequences because the gods don't exist. He corrupts youth and women. None of this is true. Epicurus lives extremely simply. He eats bread, olives, occasional cheese, drinks water, avoids excess, preaches aponia, absence of physical pains, and ataraxia, absence of mental disturbance. But the truth doesn't matter. The narrative has already been planted, and for centuries, this distortion will survive. Political power, here's the most dangerous problem. Epicurus teaches, live hidden, laith bioses. Don't enter politics, don't seek fame, don't get involved in power struggles. Why? Because politics is an infinite source of anxiety, envy, betrayal, and death. There's no ataraxia in public life. But this is a problem for the state. If people stop caring about glory, power, and public recognition, who will fight in wars? Who will sustain the empire? Who will obey tyrants? Epicurus is essentially promoting a collective exit from the system, and that's dangerous. But he doesn't back down, because he knows he's right, and he has something no other philosopher had. Concrete results. The people who follow his philosophy really do stop suffering. They live in peace. They're happy with almost nothing. And that's the most powerful proof of all. But Epicurus also knows his philosophy will be attacked, distorted, buried. So he does something smart. He begins writing compulsively. According to reports from the historian Diogenes Laertius, 3rd century A.D., Epicurus wrote more than 300 works, more than any other philosopher of antiquity. He writes treatises on physics, ethics, logic, epistemology. He writes personal letters explaining his philosophy in a didactic way. He wants to ensure that, even if the garden is destroyed, the ideas survive. And he's right to worry, because what's about to happen will almost erase Epicureanism from history. In 270 BC, Epicurus dies. He's 72 years old. He suffered from kidney stones until the end. But, according to his own letters, he died in ataraxia, tranquil, without fear, surrounded by friends. His last words, recorded by his disciples, were to Idomeneus, a close friend. On this happy day, which is also the last of my life, I write you this. The pains of the bladder and stomach continue in all their intensity, but against all this is the pleasure of my soul in recalling our past conversations. He died exactly as he taught, without fear of death, focused on the memory of pleasures, especially friendship. But the garden continues. For 200 years, the Epicurean school survives. It spreads through Athens, Rome, Alexandria. Figures like Lucretius, Roman poet of the 1st century BC, write monumental works defending Epicureanism. His poem, De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, is one of the greatest defenses of materialism and Epicurus's philosophy ever written. But then, the Roman Empire adopts Christianity, and everything changes. 4th century A.D. Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, and with that, an intellectual hunt begins. Epicurean philosophy isn't just rejected, it's demonized. Why? Because everything Epicurus taught goes directly against the pillars of Christianity. Epicurus says, the gods don't interfere in the world. Christianity says, God is actively involved, judges, punishes, and rewards. Epicurus says, death is the end. There's no immortal soul. Christianity says the soul is eternal. You will face judgment after death. Epicurus says the fear of death is irrational. Christianity says fear God, fear hell. Your eternal salvation is at stake. Epicurus says happiness is within you. It doesn't depend on external forces. Christianity says you need God. Alone, you are condemned. See the problem? If people accepted Epicurus, the church would lose its power, because the church's power doesn't come from reason. It comes from fear. Fear of hell, fear of damnation, fear of dying without salvation. Epicurus destroys that fear, and for that reason, he must be destroyed. The church fathers begin attacking him systematically. Lactantius, 4th century A.D., writes, Epicurus is the enemy of all true religion. St. Augustine, 4th to 5th century A.D., calls him philosopher of the pigs, because he teaches that pleasure is the supreme good. But this is a grotesque distortion. Epicurus never said, seek pleasure without limits. He said, seek the absence of pain and tranquility of the soul. He lived simply, preached prudence, justice, friendship, self-control. But none of that matters. The narrative has already been created. Epicurus is the libertine hedonist, the enemy of morality, the dangerous atheist, and this narrative spreads for centuries, and then comes the final blow. Epicurus's texts begin to disappear. Remember, he wrote more than 300 works. How many survived intact? 3 letters. 3. The letter to Menoetius on ethics and happiness. The letter to Herodotus on physics and atoms. The letter to Pythocles on celestial phenomena. And some maxims, fragments, quotes scattered in works by other authors. Everything else? Burned, lost, destroyed. For more than 1,000 years, the entire Middle Ages. Epicurus is a demonized, ridiculed, forgotten figure. Dante Alighieri, in the 14th century, places Epicurus in the 6th circle of hell, along with the heretics inside flaming tombs. Why? Because Epicurus denied the immortality of the soul. But something extraordinary happens in 1417. An Italian humanist named Poggio Bracciolini is searching through libraries of abandoned monasteries in Germany. And he finds something, a copy of Lucretius's poem, De Rerum Natura. It's a gigantic work, more than 7,400 verses. A complete defense of Epicurean philosophy. Atoms, void, absence of intervening gods, absence of immortal soul, absence of fear of death. Poggio copies the text by hand, takes it back to Italy, and this manuscript spreads. European Renaissance, Gutenberg printing, translation into various languages, and suddenly Epicurus returns. Philosophers begin reading him again, and they realize something shocking. Everything that was said about Epicurus was a lie. He wasn't an uncontrolled hedonist. He was a philosopher of serenity. He didn't deny morality. He defended justice, friendship, prudence, self-sufficiency. He wasn't an atheist in the modern sense. He just said the gods don't care about humans, which is a much more subtle position. And from there, a slow rehabilitation begins. Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, begin citing Epicurus with respect. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, openly declares himself an Epicurean. He writes in a letter to William Short, 1819, I am an Epicurean. I consider the genuine doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy. Karl Marx writes his doctoral thesis on Democritus and Epicurus. Friedrich Nietzsche praises Epicurus as one of the few philosophers who truly understood life. And in the 20th century, an academic renaissance begins. In 1752, in the city of Herculaneum, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, archaeologists discover an entire library of carbonized Epicurean texts. It's the Villa of the Papyri, more than 1,800 papyrus scrolls. Most are destroyed, burned, illegible, but some can be deciphered, and they contain texts by Philodemus of Gadara, one of the main Epicurean philosophers of the 1st century BC. For the first time in 2,000 years, we have direct access to new Epicurean texts. And what do they reveal? That Epicurus was right about everything. His atomistic physics? The ancient Greeks had no way to prove it, but today we know. Yes, the universe is made of indivisible particles that combine in the void. His psychology of fear? Modern neuroscience confirms much of human suffering is anticipatory. Fear of things that haven't happened yet, and may never happen. His ethics of self-sufficiency? Studies on happiness show that above a certain level of basic comfort, more money doesn't increase happiness. Relationships and purpose do. Epicurus was 2,300 years ahead of his time, and he paid the price for it. But now, finally, we're rediscovering what he tried to teach us. And the question is, why does this matter to you? You wake up at 3 in the morning, heart racing, mind racing. What if I lose my job? What if I get sick? What if the person I love leaves me? What if? You're suffering over things that haven't happened. Epicurus called this kenodoxia, empty opinion, fear based on fiction. And he would say, you're torturing yourself for nothing. Today, 2026, we live in the age of anxiety. According to the World Health Organization, more than 300 million people suffer from anxiety disorders. The burnout rate has skyrocketed. Depression is epidemic. People are medicated, exhausted, paralyzed. And what's at the center of it all? Fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of failing. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of dying without having lived enough. Epicurus would look at this generation and say, you're chasing vain desires. Social media fame. Vain desire. It will never satisfy. There will always be someone with more followers. Infinite accumulation of wealth. Vain desire. There's no enough wealth. Enough will always increase. Constant professional status? Vain desire. You'll never get there. There will always be a next step. And while you chase this, you're losing ataraxia, tranquility of the soul. But there's a way out, and it doesn't involve religion. It doesn't involve superficial self-help. It doesn't involve accumulating more things. It involves something far more radical, voluntary simplicity. Epicurus lived with almost nothing and was profoundly happy. He had close friends, he had philosophical conversations, he had simple food, fresh water, a tranquil garden. And that was enough. Not because he was special, but because he understood something fundamental. Happiness doesn't come from addition. It comes from subtraction. Subtraction of unnecessary fears, subtraction of desires impossible to satisfy, subtraction of unrealistic expectations about what life should be. And when you remove all of that, what remains? Ataraxia, tranquility of the soul. And about death, Epicurus would say, you're afraid of something you'll never experience. Death isn't an experience, it's the end of experience. You'll never wake up dead. You'll never feel the emptiness. You'll never suffer from not existing anymore. Because when you don't exist, there's no you to suffer. The fear of death is fear of a ghost, and carrying that fear for decades is absolute waste of life. Epicurus taught that true wisdom, phronesis, prudence, is knowing how to distinguish between what depends on you and what doesn't. What's necessary and what's superfluous, what brings peace and what brings suffering. And when you learn this, you free yourself. You stop living to impress strangers. You stop chasing external validation. You stop fearing things that will never happen. And you begin to live, really live, not in a fantasy of perfect life, but in a life good enough, with true friends, with simple pleasures, with a peaceful mind. Epicurus called this autarkeia, self-sufficiency, the ability to be happy independently of external circumstances. And this isn't utopia, it's training. Every day you can practice. Identify a fear. Ask, has this happened? Is it likely to happen? Can I do something about it now? If the answer is no, let it go. Identify a desire. Ask, is this necessary? Will it bring lasting peace or just temporary relief? If it's just temporary relief, reconsider. Identify a source of anxiety. Ask, am I suffering over something real or something I invented in my head? Most of the time, you invented it, and when you realize that, the suffering disappears. Epicurus didn't promise life would be easy. He promised you could be happy, regardless of circumstances. And 2,300 years later, that promise is still valid. Because the fear of death still exists. Anxiety about the future still exists. The desperate search for external validation still exists. But the solution also exists, and it always has. Since 306 BC, in a small garden in Athens. Epicurus died more than 2,000 years ago, but his philosophy is more alive than ever, because the fear he faced is the same fear you face today. Death cannot hurt you. The gods won't punish you. Pain is bearable, and happiness is closer than you think. You don't need fame. You don't need infinite wealth. You don't need external validation. You need genuine friendship, simple pleasures, mental tranquility. Epicurus gave you the map. He called it the tetrapharmakos, and it works, as long as you have the courage to apply it. Which of the 4 fears that Epicurus identified, fear of the gods, of death, of pain, or of not achieving happiness, do you feel most controls your life today?